So yesterday we were celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday. And one of the things that people do is, particularly political leaders, often try to associate themselves with King for obvious reasons. King has a very positive image from the standpoint of the United States. And it's as if invoking his name has some kind of magical power that they fill themselves with. Now, no, not in a substance standpoint, but from a political optics, maybe it may make them look a particular way for a short moment in time. But let's be very clear. The reality of things is that King was a radical. And oftentimes they try to disassociate this radical aspect of his character from the identity politics, meaning being ferociously anti-war, ferociously anti-capitalistic or anti-capitalism. But somehow separate these things, extricate those things from King when they were inextricably linked. It's as if you can have purely the guy who was pushing for identity, but not the guy that was sitting in prison, not the guy that was in jail by a system that was essentially against his interests, be it anti-capitalistic, anti-war, or in this case, anti-racist. Fact of the matter is, though, you can't have it both ways. And yet, the Democratic Party, and even to some degree the Republican Party, tries to do that. One of the more earnest interpretations of King or framings of King came from Bernie Sanders. Now, you can imagine that this is somewhat of a easy match from the standpoint of framing, especially from this kind of socialist aspect of Sanders' character. And even the anti-war stuff that Sanders has been pushing, even though, of course, it's not going to be to the level of King. I guess I'm just trying to make this point that many of the people, political leaders, try to create this caricature of King as a dreamer or as purely this guy who's pushing for issues of identity, missing the fact of an anti-capitalistic and anti-war, something that none of them will be on board with today. Let's take a look at Sanders. I'm gonna give the entirety of the speech. It came out on Facebook. I'm gonna just let it play. Bernie Sanders giving an MLK speech in South Carolina. Cory Booker was here. You can imagine what Cory Booker would say, but I like the speech from Sanders, which is why I'm going to play the speech from Sanders. And it's one of the few people who made this argument that Martin Luther King was a revolutionary, and he was pushing up against the system not just for racial justice, but also for economic justice. And of course, issues of war, going with items from abroad, specifically in the context of the Vietnam War. When he put his own personal safety on the line, even beyond the threat to his own life, in order to push back on the Vietnam War. And you can imagine this was LBJ's war at this time, and LBJ was to some degree given King an end politically. This was very dangerous for King, and he put himself out on the line, understanding that nothing could take place within the United States from the standpoint of accomplishing what he wants to accomplish in this kind of economic justice, while we're spending a large share of our wealth killing and bombing and maiming people overseas in these foreign conflicts. Let's take a look at Sanders, Martin Luther King as a revolutionary. By the way, the guy screaming, I think he's saying hallelujah, is hilarious.
And let me express my pleasure being here with my fellow Senator Cory Booker. And let me thank Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter for her wonderful words. And let me thank the NAACP for inviting me, and especially for making me feel at home with this freezing weather, just like Vermont. Appreciate it. Hallelujah. We are here today not just to remember, not just to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are here today to understand that King had a revolutionary spirit. Yes, he was a revolutionary. That's right. And we are going to stand with him on taking on the political and economic establishment and creating a government that works for all of us, not just the few. Now, Dr. King had many enormous accomplishments, Voting Rights Act, many other accomplishments. But he also was a man not only of accomplishment, but of extraordinary courage. Hallelujah. I want to take you back to 1967. King had won the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. King was honored all over the world. And yet King looked out at that country, and he looked out at the war in Vietnam.
That's right.
And people said to him, Dr. King, you are a civil rights leader. Why are you going to talk about the war in Vietnam? And with enormous courage, King said, how can I preach nonviolence when our country is involved in a brutal war?
That's right.
How can I speak for the poor when we're spending billions of dollars bombing that country?
Lord, have mercy.
And King spoke up, and you know what happened? Editorial writer after editorial writer criticized him.
That's right.
Many of his liberal friends deserted him.
That's right.
And the President of the United States turned on him.
That's a shame.
But what he reminded us is courage of conscience. That we stand up no matter what the odds and take on the power to fight for economic justice,
all right,
to fight for social justice,
all right,
to fight for racial justice,
yes,
to fight for environmental justice.
all right.
Today we talk about justice, and today we talk about racism. And I must tell you, it gives me no pleasure to tell you that we now have a President of the United States who is a racist.
Hallelujah, man. Hallelujah, man, buddy.
We have a President of the United States who has done something that no other president in modern history has done. What a president is supposed to do is to bring us together.
That's right.
And we have a president intentionally, purposely, is trying to divide us up by the color of our skin, by our gender, by the country we came from, by our religion. Now everybody here knows that from the first days when the settlers came to this country and the terrible things they did to the Native Americans, everybody knows about the abomination of slavery and segregation.
Hallelujah.
We know about the discrimination against Catholics and Jews and Muslims and Irish and Italian.
Come on.
So we say to President Trump today, this country has suffered too long from discrimination. We are not going backwards. We are going forwards to a non-discriminatory society. But racism is, you have heard from other speakers, exists in this country today, and it exists when the median white family owns 10 times more wealth than the median African-American family.
Come on, talk about it.
Racial equality must be central to combating economic equality if we are going to create a government that works for all of us and not just the 1%. Racism is alive when the United States Supreme Court and Republican governors make it harder for people of color to vote than when they suppress the vote. And that is why I believe
Come on.
We need a constitutional amendment to guarantee every American the right to vote. And that we enact automatic voter registration. If you are 18 years of age, if you're black, if you're white, if you're Latino, you are registered to vote. End of discussion. Racism is alive and well when we have a broken criminal justice system and we have more people in jail than any other country on earth.
Hallelujah, man.
We need in this country real criminal justice reform.
That's right.
And that means we need jobs and education for our young people, not more jails and incarceration. It means ending the cash bail system, which puts people in jail for the crime of being poor. Hundreds of thousands of people rotting in jail because they're poor and can't afford bail. It means ending the so-called war on drugs, which has caused so much pain and destruction in this country. It means ending private prisons. In America, you should not be making billions in profit by locking up and incarcerating your fellow Americans. It means when we talk about criminal justice reform, understanding that we need police reform and that lethal force is the last resort, not the first. Racism exists in our country when we have massive levels of healthcare disparity. When the infant mortality rates in the black community is more than double what it is in the white community, and death rates from cancer and almost every other disease is far higher for blacks than whites. In my view, not only do we have to expand primary health care throughout this country, and Congressman Clyburn and I have worked on it and are working on it now. We're going to have more community health centers in Vermont and South Carolina. But more importantly, in America, we have got to do what every other industrialized country does, guarantee health care to all as a right through a Medicare for all single-payer program. Racism is there when gentrification pushes out black renters, black homeowners, and black business owners from communities where their families have lived for decades.
Come on, brother.
Racism is here when the United States of America has shamefully the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, and 34% of black kids live in poverty. Racism is here when black schools are overcrowded, inadequately funded, and staffed with less experienced teachers, and when the African American young people dropout rate is much too high. In my view, we have got to understand that education is a human right, and that in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, we should be providing quality health care to every child. And when we talk about education, which is the theme of today, we all know that the most important years of a child's life, of a human being's life, is 0 through 4. And that is why we need universal, affordable child care. When we talk about education, We understand that today a college degree is equivalent to what a high school degree was 50 years ago. It is not a radical idea to say that in a country which spends $700 billion a year on the military, which gives $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1% in large corporations, it is not a radical idea to say that we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free, and that we're going to lower student debt for the millions of people, and that we are going to adequately fund the historically black colleges and universities in this country. Now, in 1963, a few years ago, when I was a college student, I had the honor of being in Washington, D.C. to hear Dr. King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And along with hundreds of thousands of other Americans were there that day. We were there to demand an end to racism and to support Dr. King's call for economic justice.
Hallelujah.
Because let us never forget that the title of that march was Jobs and Freedom. Jobs and freedom. And I find it remarkable that 56 years after that march, many of the demands that Dr. King and others made are still demands that we have got to fight for today.
All right, sir.
Back in 1963, Dr. King demanded that workers be paid a living wage.
That's right.
Today, we have got to fulfill that demand and raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour. During that march, Dr. King and other organizers demanded adequate and integrated education. This is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Our children deserve the best public education system in the world.
Pump it up, Bernie! Pump it up, Bernie!
During that march, Dr. King and others demanded decent and affordable housing. And yet in Vermont and in South Carolina and all over this country, working people are paying 40, 50% of their limited incomes for housing.
That's a shame. It's a shame.
Instead of giving tax breaks to billionaires, let's put our people to work building affordable housing.
Pump it up, Bernie!
Instead of building a wall with Mexico, let us build the housing our people need.
Hallelujah, Bernie!
During that march, think about it, back in 1963, Dr. King and other organizers demanded a federal jobs program in order to make sure that everybody in America who wanted to work could get a job. And that is a dream we must fulfill. Think about all of the work that has to be done in providing health care to all, into transforming our economy so that we combat climate change. Think about all the jobs out there that we need to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Let us fulfill the demand that King made back in 1963 and say that in America, if you want to work, we have a meaningful, well-paying job there for you. Brothers and sisters, Dr. King, in my view, was one of the great leaders, not only in American history, but in modern world history.
That's right, that's right.
He was a man of unbelievable courage, who understood not only that we have got to end racism,
Hallelujah, man!
but that we need economic justice.
Yes.
Remember where he was when he died. He was in Memphis, Tennessee,
That's right.
standing with exploited sanitation workers who were struggling for decent wages.
That's right.
Think of the work he was doing at the end of his life. What he was organizing was a poor people's march. Remember that?
Yes.
And what he said is, we are going to bring together black workers and Latino workers and white workers and Native American workers. And we are going to change the national priorities of this country
Yes.
so that in this country, justice rings out for all. That every American, regardless of the color of his skin, regardless of whether he or she is rich or poor, can have the quality of life that all human beings deserve.
Hallelujah.
So today we are here not just to remember Dr. King, not just to honor Dr. King. We are here to feel his revolutionary spirit, to have the courage to take on the economic and political establishment, and to create the kind of nation we know we can become. Thank you all very much.
Great speech. That was a damn good speech. I was sitting here listening to him, and I was like, that is somewhat of a barn burner of a speech. And by the way, he's right. The marches that Martin Luther King was, it was jobs and freedom. It was both. I guess I'm trying to make the point that jobs was inextricably linked to the character of the person that we're talking about. Yeah, great speech. Great speech. Jamal, video idea. Jimmy Dore failed on Nathan Phillips' coverage. Amy Goodman kicked his ass in this case. Bella Lou. I was looking at the Nathan Phillips thing. I haven't watched Jimmy Dore's coverage of this. From my understanding, this is somewhat of a perspective issue. A group started off. Well, I'll do that video. I'll do a separate video on that. Great speech by Sanders, though. Great speech by Sanders. Let's see. Jamal, let's say it again. Why is it that all Section 8 housing is not solar powered, using alternative energy, bring them home for a Green New Deal? I agree with you. So, as I watched the speech, though, there were a few things, and some of these things are interrelated. So, Sanders said, you know, why is it that African Americans die from these diseases at a higher rate than whites? But I would suspect to some degree that's probably connected to why do whites have 10 times more wealth than the average African American family. Like, that is a stunning statistic. But all of those things are related. It's like, why do more inexperienced teachers end up at, you know, schools from African Americans? It's like, well, if those schools are in a bad neighborhood and those teachers have more experience, if you have more experience, you may go to try to get to a better neighborhood. Just from your own personal, you know, from your own incentives, some of these things kind of take place. A family eating worse products, maybe eating shittier products, because they can't necessarily afford the lifestyle of somebody who's making 10 times more than they're making. And by the way, just so we're clear, there are more whites on welfare than blacks, but from the standpoint of the levels of poverty, just by that number, 10 to 1, gets across the disparity there. But I would argue that the other stats are fruit from the poisonous tree, meaning the fact that there is such an economic disparity there, the outcomes become worse, if that makes sense. But I think all those things are fruit from the poisonous tree. I love the speech by Sanders. Now, mind you, they're trying to scoop up as many African Americans as they can scoop up, meaning the Democratic Party. So there's like a what is it called, grab bag, or power grab for the blacks, and so, you know, and there's also something to be said that whites, in an odd way, are almost socially allowed to go after certain issues with more ferocity than African Americans in some cases. Like Obama was terrified of going that way from the standpoint of the language, whereas Sanders can hit that language without any headwind. Hell, he can go out, call Donald Trump a racist, and, you know, nobody bats an eye. And so understand, in front of a black audience, it's not entirely a black audience, but, you know, this speech is being done through the NAACP, and he is hitting those notes. But he's hitting those notes in an earnest way. I guess that's the point I'm trying to get across. This is not something where he has to gin up. It's not like a Cory Booker fake stuff. He's like, I was there at the I Have a Dream speech. That is fucking amazing. I didn't know he was there at the I Had a Dream speech. But, you know, this is something that goes back to Sanders when he was a kid. So this is not a new position that he's evolving to. Yeah, the speech was awesome. The speech was absolutely awesome. All right. I am going to do... I'm going to do... Bella, I'm going to do a video on the Nathan Phillips coverage thing, because there were two stories that were coming out that were competing with one another. The Native American was being intimidated, and then the other one was Nathan Phillips was just standing there with that stupid fucking smirk on his face, but he wasn't doing anything to anybody. And he's, you know, a tender-hearted guy who just so happened to wear the the build the wall hat or the Trump hat. He was just standing there while people were chanting build the wall. He wasn't touched by it at all. So you got two competing narrative of events. But I don't necessarily think each narrative kills the other narrative, even though they played it as if it did. I'm going to do that coverage. I stayed away from it until I had a better idea on what the hell was taking place in that story, just because of the multiple stories that were coming up. But I'll do that story. Apparently people are really paying attention to it. All right, I'll end this here. Let me check out the Amy Goodman version of this. I would say this: if you bring a kid into this world, you should be able to take care of that kid. And I'm saying from the standpoint of the overarching society, meaning the country. There's no reason for the richest country on the planet to have anybody sleeping on the street, to have people not being able to get an adequate job if they wanted an adequate job, a good, well-meaning job, not pressing a button, not dropping french fries. I'm talking about a well-meaning job that pays a person a decent living wage. I've been on record of saying, if there's a robot that can do something better than the person, let the robot do something better than the person. The problem here is the way we organize and structure our society, where the productivity from that robot goes to a top 1%, as opposed to being beneficial to the whole of society and making people be able to work less. Fact of the matter is, though, we do have a lot of stuff that needs to take place to transform this society. An idea that will give millionaires and billionaires trillions in tax cuts, while at the same token that money operationally used in the country itself for the benefit of the population could be used to do all sorts of positive things. High-speed rail, free public education. Like, imagine if you're looking for a country, the unlocked potential, or conservatives always talk about unlocking potential, allowing people to be able to go to school when they want to go to school for the subject they want to go to school without the penalty of hitting them over the head with a $50,000 bill. That's your gateway. That's your gateway. I'm just saying. I'll end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. And as I said in that earlier video, there's going to be a Patreon appreciation drive that's going to come up next month, with additional content, I think, being added to Patreon. That additional content is going to be beyond just the Patreon appreciation. It's going to go to the after shows. I think the after shows will work. So I'm going to end this here. D. Martin. Jamarl will report on any Sanders campaign news releases. Yes. Yeah, I'll hold that. I'll take that. I mean, of all the horses, clearly I am backing this one. I love that speech. And D. Martin, there's no way you can listen to that speech and come away saying, you know, fuck Sanders. How? He's not exactly the thing that you want. Fair enough. But god damn it, he's the closest. And if we're talking about moving from point A to point B in a real fashion that goes beyond this incrementalism stuff, this is the horse that I am backing. Bernie Independent 2020 is better than Bernie Democrat in 2020. Oh, Belt, I don't know if I agree with you on that one, man. I don't know if I agree with you on that. Could Bernie low-key be asking us to start a revolution? Bernie, it's not low-key. Join the Matsu. It's not a low-key. It's not low-key at all. I mean, he's talking about a sea change in regards to how we go about what? He's talking about banking. He's talking about wages. He's talking about education and healthcare. Like, this is a overhaul. He's talking about environmental change. Instead of giving trillions to the top 1% to use that money to essentially revolutionize the way this infrastructure of this country, that's a sea change. That's a sea change. I don't want Tom Perez forcing concessions on policy. Tom Perez is going to lose his job if Bernie Sanders is elected president of the United States. There's no way he's going to put Tom Perez back in that seat. It's the president or the head of the party that chooses who runs the DNC. And if that is Bernie Sanders, Tom Perez is not going to have that job. Just saying. Just saying. All right. I'm going to end this here. Look, the left may not know exactly what he wants from the standpoint of what he wants the world to exactly look like. I would suggest that pushing worker co-ops will be one of the ways that Sanders goes to accomplish his goal, as opposed to trying to forcibly take money from a particular class. He can put that money in the pockets of that class just as a natural way of its operation. But as a New Deal Democrat, I like him. I like him. I understand you guys feel some kind of way, but of all the horses, this is the one I'm backing. I'll end this here. Trudy, I could easily live off $1,600 a month. What's happening, Trudy? I guess it depends on where you are, right, Trudy? I mean, in some places, rent is $1,600 a month by itself. $15 an hour isn't enough. I'm inclined to agree with you, but keep in mind the federal minimum wage is like $7. And it's not enough in the context of having to pay for school, having to pay for healthcare, having to pay for etc. But if public transportation was free, you know, let's have a thought experiment. If healthcare was free, I mean, granted, it's coming out of our taxes, but you don't have to pay at the point of sale. Education, like if these expenses are pulled away from you, like your living expenses goes down. I mean, granted, you have this thing of rent, and in various places, rent, you know, it's expanding. But his point is, we as a society can do things to lessen the burden of society. Education, healthcare would be a big one. Education would be a big one. I would go further into public transportation. I would go further and say public transportation should be in the hands of public, the vital infrastructure, vital resources. But Sanders is not going to go that far. But I'm just saying, that's a direction that I want to move in, and that's somewhat of a sharp direction shift. FDR was able to instantiate a paradigm on the Democratic Party that lasted for 40, 50 years. Is this a shift? I know a lot of you say no. My answer is I don't necessarily know. This is a wait and see. But above this, Sanders is my guy. So I'll end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks, everyone.